My fiancée said, "I don't love you anymore," in front of everyone. Then her dad leaned in and said, "Good, now tell him the part about the baby." I thought my engagement party was going to be one of those awkward but happy nights where people eat too much, tell embarrassing stories, and go home early because it's a weeknight. And instead my fiancé ended it in front of everyone, and then her dad made it worse on purpose. My name is Liam, I'm 30, my fiancée Sloane is 29, and we've been together a little over 4 years, engaged for 6 months, living together for 2, and I want to be clear about something. We weren't perfect, but we weren't at the point where you expect someone to drop a sentence like "I don't love you anymore" into the middle of a party like it's a toast. The party was at her parents' house because her dad insisted. He's the type of man who needs to be the host even when it isn't his moment. And the house is one of those big perfect houses where everything looks staged but not cold, like a catalog. Her dad, Vaughn, is the kind of guy who shakes your hand too hard, calls you buddy, and somehow makes every conversation feel like a negotiation. And I never liked him, but I told myself I was being sensitive because Sloane loves her mom and her mom loves him, and I wanted peace. The guest list was mostly her side, her cousins, her mom's friends, a few of Vaughn's coworkers, and enough people I didn't know that I was already in that polite smile mode, doing the nodding and laughing and accepting congratulations like it didn't feel weird to have strangers talking about my future kids. My side was smaller: my sister, 2 friends from work, and my best friend Mason, and the reason I remember that is because Mason was the only person there who kept giving me this look like he could sense the tension. Sloane looked pretty, not dramatic, just nice, hair curled, simple dress, ring catching the light, and she was acting normal for most of the night. She held my hand, she leaned into me, she laughed at the right times, she even did a little squeeze when her aunt told a story about Sloane as a kid. Then Vaughn clinked his glass, that annoying sharp sound that instantly makes everyone turn their heads, and he announced we were going to do a few words and then cake, and I remember feeling relieved because I thought, okay, we're almost done, we'll go home, we'll talk about how exhausting this was, and we'll laugh about it. Sloane stood up first, which surprised me because we never planned speeches, we planned a quick thank you, we planned to keep it simple, and she took the center of the living room like she was stepping onto a stage. I was right beside her, smiling like an idiot, and she looked around at everyone and she said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "Thank you for supporting us," and her voice sounded steady, almost too steady. Then she turned her head and looked at me, and her eyes did not look like her eyes, they looked flat, like someone pulled the warmth out, and she said, "I don't love you anymore." It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't a private confession, it was clear, loud enough for every corner of that room, and for a second the entire party froze, like even the air stopped moving. I felt my face go hot and cold at the same time, and my brain did this stupid thing where it tried to interpret it as a joke, like maybe she's doing a bit, maybe she's teasing, but her mouth didn't change, her hands didn't shake, nothing softened it. Someone laughed, one awkward burst, and then stopped, and I saw Sloane's mother's smile collapse, and I saw my sister's hand move to her own mouth, and I heard one of Vaughn's coworkers say "what the heck" under his breath. I said Sloane's name, not loud, just enough for her, and she didn't even flinch. She just said she couldn't do this anymore. She said she wanted to be honest. She said she couldn't pretend. I looked at Vaughn because I didn't know where else to look, and he wasn't shocked, he wasn't confused. He looked satisfied, like this was a plan being executed. Sloane's mom tried to step forward, her hands out like she could physically catch the moment before it hit the ground, and Vaughn put a hand out like a barrier and told everyone to give Sloane space, and he said it with that calm voice he uses when he wants to sound reasonable. I felt my throat tighten, and I started to move toward the front door because I needed air and I needed to not be standing there while a room full of people watched me get dumped like a show. Sloane didn't follow me, she stayed in the center of the room, and Vaughn followed me instead, and that should tell you everything. He caught up right when I hit the entryway, and he leaned in close to my ear like this was a private supportive moment, and he said, "Good, now tell him the part about the baby." I froze so hard it felt like my body locked, and I turned back and I saw Sloane staring at Vaughn like she was waiting for permission, and Vaughn nodded once like he was confirming a cue. Then Sloane raised her voice again and said she was pregnant, and she said it in the same steady voice as the "I don't love you anymore" line. The room exploded, not screaming, but a flood of voices, gasps, people talking over each other, Sloane's mom making a sound like she was about to faint, and Vaughn doing that calm hand motion like he was directing traffic. I stood there gripping the doorframe because my legs felt weak, and all I could think was, this is not real, this is not my life. Vaughn turned and looked at me like a businessman closing a deal, and he said we needed to talk privately, and he said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was offering dignity after publicly humiliating me. Mason pushed through the crowd then, right up to my side and asked if I was okay, and Vaughn immediately snapped at him to mind his business. And that moment felt so telling because Vaughn wasn't acting like a father worried about his daughter, he was acting like a man protecting a plan. I told Vaughn no, I told him I wasn't talking privately in his house after what just happened, and I told Sloane I was leaving. Sloane finally moved. She stepped toward me, her eyes glossy now, like the emotional weight finally hit her after the performance ended, and she said my name in a small voice, and then she looked at Vaughn again like she was checking if she was allowed to say more. Vaughn leaned into her again and I heard him say, "Tell him you need it in writing." I remember this so clearly because it wasn't a dad trying to comfort his pregnant daughter, it was a manager coaching an employee. Sloane told me she had papers for me. She told me it would be easier if I just signed so things could stay clean, and she said clean like she was talking about laundry. I said what papers, and Vaughn stepped toward me with a folder already in his hand, a folder that was not sitting around casually, a folder he had ready, and he said it was just acknowledgement paperwork. He said it wasn't complicated. He said it was to protect everyone. I took one look at the top page and saw legal language and signature lines, and I felt anger finally kick in, not a screaming anger, a cold anger, because I realized they were trying to get me to sign something in the middle of shock in front of witnesses after humiliating me. I handed it back without reading and told him I wasn't signing anything tonight, and Vaughn's smile tightened, and he said if I loved Sloane I would do the right thing. That word love made me almost laugh because Sloane had just announced she didn't love me anymore, and now he wanted to use love like a lever. I told him he doesn't get to bring love into this, and Vaughn's eyes sharpened, and he said fine, then be smart. And he told me the baby needed stability, and he told me Sloane couldn't do it alone, and he told me he expected me to step up like a man. I said I didn't even know if the baby was mine, and the second I said it, the room got quiet in a weird ripple, like the people closest to us heard, and then everyone else realized something heavy had been said. Sloane flinched like I slapped her, and Vaughn's jaw tightened, and Sloane's mom whispered Sloane like it was a prayer. Vaughn looked at me and said of course it was mine, and he said it too fast, too confident, and that made my stomach twist because honest people don't rush reassurance like that. Sloane started crying then, not loud sobbing but tears spilling fast, and she said she didn't want it like this, and Vaughn snapped at her to stop crying in front of everyone, and then he turned back to me with that controlled smile like he didn't just bark at his daughter. I told Sloane we would talk later privately when she was away from him, and Vaughn stepped closer and said no, and I will never forget this. He said no like he had authority over whether we could speak. Mason put a hand on my shoulder and told me we were leaving, and my sister appeared right behind him, pale and furious. And she told Sloane she was disgusting for doing this in front of everyone, and Sloane's mom started crying too, and suddenly the whole thing was chaos. I walked out, and the last thing I saw before the door closed was Vaughn leaning toward Sloane's ear again, whispering calm as ever, while Sloane stood there shaking. In the car, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't put the key in the ignition on the first try, and Mason offered to drive, but I needed to be doing something with my hands or I felt like I would fall apart. Mason kept asking what that was, and I kept saying I don't know because I didn't, and my brain was replaying Vaughn's words. Good, now tell him the part about the baby, like he had been waiting to spring it, like he wanted an audience. My sister called me on the drive home and told me not to go back to that house alone, and she told me not to sign anything, and she told me she would come over, and I said okay because I didn't trust myself to be alone in my own living room that night. Sloane called me once, then twice, then 5 times, and I didn't answer, not because I wanted revenge, but because I couldn't listen to her voice without hearing that line in front of everyone. She finally texted. She said please talk to me. She said I didn't want to do it like that. She said I'm sorry. She said my dad made it worse, and she said the baby is real. I stared at that text and felt this weird dizziness because it was the first time she blamed Vaughn, and it was also the first time she confirmed pregnancy in a private message, and my brain started trying to build explanations. Maybe she cheated and her dad wants to pin it on me. Maybe she's pregnant with mine but wants out and her dad wants control. Maybe she isn't pregnant at all and this is a stunt, and every possibility made me feel sick in a different way. When I got home, my sister and Mason came inside with me, and I did something I never do. I checked my own hallway for something like I was paranoid, because Vaughn's energy made me feel like he would show up, like he would keep pushing until he got what he wanted. I sat on my couch staring at nothing while my sister made me drink water, and Mason kept packing like he wanted to go back and yell at someone, and my phone kept buzzing with Sloane's messages. Around midnight, Sloane sent one more text that made my stomach drop. She said Vaughn already told the family I agreed to do the right thing. She said he told them we just needed time to process, and she said he was telling people not to contact me because I was overwhelmed. That is what scared me the most, not the breakup line, not even the pregnancy, the fact he was already controlling the narrative like a public relations person, like he was trying to isolate me by telling everyone I was too fragile to talk. The next morning, I woke up with that heavy adrenaline hangover feeling, and I checked my email, and there was an email from an unknown address with a subject line that said fatherhood acknowledgement, and it had a scanned copy of the same papers Vaughn tried to hand me. It also had a message that said sign and return today, because the sooner this is handled, the sooner we can all move forward. No hello, no empathy, just a deadline. Mason told me to get a lawyer immediately, and my sister told me the same, and I did, because I am not walking into a trap with my name, my finances, and my future child support tied to it. While I was doing that, Sloane finally called again, and I answered, and the first thing she said was not "Are you okay?" not "I'm sorry." She said Vaughn is freaking out and you need to calm him down. That sentence hit me like a slap because she was still treating him like the real center of the crisis. Not me, not our relationship, not the baby, Vaughn. I told her no, and I told her I wanted to talk to her without him, and she said she couldn't. She said she was at their house. She said she wasn't alone, and her voice sounded small. I asked her if she was actually pregnant, and she said yes, and she started crying, and she said she was scared, and she said she didn't know how to say it. And then she said the part that made my stomach drop further. She said she didn't know how sure she was. I asked what she meant, and she said there was a short break months ago, a week where we weren't speaking, and she said she went out and got drunk and she made a mistake, and she said she never told me because she thought it didn't matter, and then she found out she was pregnant and Vaughn found out too. I asked how Vaughn found out first because that made no sense, and she hesitated and said because she went to a doctor appointment with her mom and Vaughn insisted on driving them, and he wouldn't leave the room, and I felt my skin crawl because that meant Vaughn wasn't just controlling the party, he was controlling her body too. I asked her why she said she didn't love me anymore, and she said Vaughn told her to say it, and she said he said it would make me cooperate faster, because if I thought she was leaving me, I would focus on the baby and not on fixing the relationship, and she said it like she realized how sick it was as she spoke. I sat there holding the phone and staring at my kitchen counter because I could not understand how a father could coach his daughter to humiliate her fiancé to force signatures, and I could not understand why she went along with it. Sloane said Vaughn keeps saying the baby needs a father on paper. She said he keeps saying it has to be clean, and she said he keeps saying if it gets messy, people will talk, and she whispered people will talk like that was the real threat, not my life being detonated. I told her I wasn't signing anything until paternity was confirmed, and she went quiet, and then she said Vaughn will never allow that, and that is the sentence that made me write this post, because it told me exactly what this is, control. So right now my engagement is publicly over. My fiancée is allegedly pregnant. Her father is sending me legal documents like I'm an employee, and I don't even know what is true beyond the fact I was humiliated in front of a room full of people. And I need advice on what to do next, because I feel like I'm standing on a trapdoor and the person holding the lever is not even my fiancé, it's her dad. Update 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later, and I feel like my life has become paperwork and whispers because the party didn't end when I left, it spread. The first thing I did after that post was get a lawyer, and that was the best decision I've made in this mess, because Vaughn's entire strategy was shock and speed, and a lawyer turns shock into slow, and slow is where traps fall apart. Sloane kept messaging me during the first week, sometimes apologizing, sometimes begging me to just sign something so her dad would calm down, and every time she said calm down it made me feel like I was being asked to feed a wild animal to keep it from biting. My lawyer told me not to engage in any discussion about signing anything, not even casually, and to keep everything in writing, and to stop taking phone calls unless I was recording for my own protection, because Vaughn had already shown he liked witnesses when it benefited him. I asked Sloane to meet me somewhere public without Vaughn, without her mom, just us, and she agreed, and then she showed up with her mom anyway. Her mom, Denise, looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, her eyes were swollen, and she hugged me like I was still family. And for a second I almost broke down because it was the first human moment in a month. Sloane looked thinner, jittery, and she kept glancing at the parking lot like she expected Vaughn to appear. We sat at a diner and Sloane started crying immediately, and she said she was sorry, and she said she didn't want the party to be like that, and she said Vaughn convinced her it was the only way to keep things from getting ugly. I told her it was already ugly, and she nodded and said she knows, and she said Vaughn wanted to do it in front of everyone because he wanted to control the story, and if he controlled the story he could control me. Then she said something that made my stomach turn in a new way. She said Vaughn had already spoken to a notary before the party, and he had already told people I was a good guy who would step up, and he had already told her cousins that they should be ready to support Sloane because I might panic. He had set up a version where I was unstable before I even knew what was happening, and that was the point, because if I argued it would fit the story he planted. I asked Sloane why she was so scared of him, and she looked at her mom, and her mom looked down at her coffee like it was the most interesting thing in the world, and Sloane whispered that Vaughn wasn't her biological father. Denise's head snapped up at that, and I could see she didn't want this said out loud, and that alone told me it was true. Sloane said her biological dad left when she was little. Vaughn came in later, and he made himself the center of everything, and he has spent years acting like he saved them, and he uses that like a debt Denise and Sloane can never repay. She said Vaughn monitors Denise's spending, he monitors Sloane's accounts, and he keeps everything under his name, and she said she used to think it was just controlling but harmless, and then the pregnancy happened and she realized he sees her as property. I asked again as calmly as I could whether she was actually pregnant, and she said yes, and she slid her phone across the table and showed me an ultrasound photo, and my stomach twisted because it looked real enough to be real. Then she said she didn't know whose baby it was, and she said Vaughn demanded she say it was mine, because he said if the father was uncertain, the family would look bad, and he said if I signed, it would be done, and he said if I didn't sign, he could make it a nightmare. Denise finally spoke then and said Vaughn was terrified of shame, and she said it like an apology, like shame explains cruelty. I asked Sloane why she didn't just tell me the truth privately from the start, why she didn't come to me before the party and say I made a mistake and I'm pregnant and I'm scared. And she started sobbing harder and said Vaughn took her phone that morning and told her she wasn't allowed to tell me anything until he said so. That line made my chest tighten because taking her phone is not normal, that is not an overbearing parent, that is control. I told her I wasn't signing anything, and I told her the only way I would even discuss next steps is if paternity is tested through a legitimate process that I arranged with my lawyer, and Sloane nodded like she wanted that, but Denise looked terrified. Denise said Vaughn would never allow it because it would expose the timeline, and I asked what timeline, and Denise went pale. Sloane said Vaughn had been telling people he and Denise were the victims of me, and that I was refusing to step up, and he had been calling family members and crying, apparently actually crying, which is funny because I have never seen that man genuinely emotional in my life. Then Sloane admitted something that made everything even more complicated. She said Vaughn knew about my finances, specifically a trust my grandmother left me. I hadn't even told Sloane the exact number. I told her it existed, I told her it wasn't something I touched, and I told her it was meant to help with a house down payment someday, and I told her it wasn't anyone's business. Sloane said Vaughn somehow found paperwork in her room months ago, and he started asking weird questions, and he started making comments about how a man proves himself by taking care of a family, and she said she thought it was just him being him. Then the pregnancy happened, and Vaughn suddenly became obsessed with getting my signature, obsessed with making it official, obsessed with doing it fast, and now I understood why. After the diner, Vaughn started calling me from different numbers, and when I blocked one, another appeared, and he left voicemails that sounded calm but were threatening if you listen closely. He would say things like I don't want lawyers involved, and he would say things like don't make me protect my family, and he would say things like you have a responsibility now. My lawyer sent a message through proper channels telling Vaughn not to contact me directly, and the next day Vaughn showed up at my job parking lot. He didn't come inside, he waited by my car like he knew exactly where I parked, and that felt like a violation all by itself, and when I approached, he smiled like he was greeting a friend. He told me we needed to talk like men, and he told me he didn't want to embarrass Sloane further, and he told me he knew I was a good guy, and he kept repeating good guy like it was both praise and trap. I told him any communication goes through my lawyer, and he leaned in and said if I make it legal, he can make it expensive. And then he said something that I'm still hearing in my head. He said he knows how men like me hide money. I told him to step away from my car, and he stepped closer instead and said he can make sure the court sees me as the kind of man who abandons a pregnant woman, and he said it like he was already imagining headlines. That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as an annoying future-in-law and started thinking of him as an actual threat. Sloane agreed to a prenatal appointment where I could attend and verify, and my lawyer told me to do it if I wanted closure but not to sign anything and not to go alone, so my sister came with me and waited outside. At the clinic, Vaughn showed up anyway, even though Sloane told him not to, and he walked into the waiting area like he owned the place, and he tried to follow us back, and the staff stopped him, and he made a scene, not loud but sharp. He told the receptionist he was the father, meaning Sloane's father, and he had a right to be involved. I watched Sloane's shoulders shrink as he spoke, and it made me furious in a clean way because I could see the pattern he pushes until the other person folds. Sloane confirmed pregnancy in the appointment, and that part was real, and I felt dizzy hearing it from a professional voice, because it turned the party from a nightmare performance into a real living consequence. Afterward, Vaughn cornered me near the exit and said we could handle this privately, and he pulled out the same folder again like he keeps it in his car like a weapon, and he told me to sign a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity, and he said it was just paperwork. I told him no, and I told him I was arranging a legal prenatal test, and he laughed, actually laughed, and he said that isn't necessary, and the way he said it made my stomach drop because it wasn't just dismissive, it sounded like he knew something. That night, Sloane messaged me and said Vaughn was furious, and she said he took her car keys and she said she felt trapped, and Denise messaged me too and said please don't antagonize him, and that message made me feel sick because everyone's solution was always to keep Vaughn calm, never to stop him. The next week, my lawyer arranged a non-invasive prenatal paternity test through a legitimate lab, expensive but worth it for clarity, and Sloane agreed to provide the needed sample, and then something happened that convinced me Vaughn was actively sabotaging. On the morning Sloane was supposed to go in, she texted me that her appointment was canceled, and when I called the clinic, they said it wasn't canceled, it was rescheduled by someone who claimed to be her, and the number used to confirm was not hers. Sloane called me crying and said Vaughn took her phone again, and she said he told her if she took the test, he would tell everyone she cheated and he would make sure she lost support, and he said he would make sure she was alone. I drove to Denise's house where Sloane was staying at that point, and I didn't go inside. I stood on the sidewalk and told Sloane to come out, and Vaughn came out instead. He stood on the porch and told me to leave, and he said it like he was ordering a delivery driver off his property. And I told him he doesn't get to decide who Sloane speaks to, and he smiled and said he already did. My sister was with me and she started recording on her phone, and Vaughn noticed, and he stepped forward and told her to stop, and he said it calmly but his eyes were hard, and my sister said no, and Vaughn said then I'll call the police and tell them you're harassing my pregnant daughter, and he said pregnant daughter like I was a stranger, like he was rewriting reality again. That's where this update ends because the test is now scheduled under stricter privacy. My lawyer is documenting Vaughn's interference, and Sloane is finally talking about leaving her parents' house entirely. But I'm also realizing I might be dealing with a man who's willing to fabricate stories, weaponize the public, and isolate his own daughter to keep control, and I don't know how far he will go when he feels the plan slipping. Update 2 months later. 2 months later, and if someone told me 6 months ago that my relationship would turn into legal strategy meetings and clinic security protocols, I would have laughed, but this is my life now. The prenatal paternity test finally happened, and we did it quietly with my lawyer involved, and Sloane showed up alone, no Vaughn, no Denise, and she looked like a person who hasn't slept properly in weeks. When we got the results, my stomach dropped in a way I didn't expect, because the results said I was not the father. I felt relief for about half a second, then it got replaced by something that felt like grief and anger smashed together, because relief meant the baby wasn't mine, but it also meant everything that happened at that party was built on a lie, and it meant Vaughn had been trying to force me to sign paternity paperwork knowing there was a real chance it was false. Sloane cried so hard she couldn't breathe, and she kept saying she thought it was mine, and she kept saying she didn't know, and then she admitted the break she mentioned was worse than she told me. She said the week we weren't speaking, Vaughn pushed her to go out, Vaughn pushed her to drink, Vaughn told her she needed to loosen up and stop being so attached to me, and she told me she met someone at a bar and made a stupid decision, and she said she regretted it immediately, and she swore she never saw the guy again. Denise confirmed that Vaughn had been angry with Sloane during that period, angry that she was planning her life with me instead of staying under his roof, and angry that she didn't obey him instantly, and I started to see the outline of something darker. Vaughn didn't want Sloane to have independence, and he didn't want me as a son-in-law unless I was controllable. After the results, Vaughn pivoted instantly, and the pivot was so fast it was almost impressive in a gross way. He started telling people the test was fake, he started telling people I paid for a result I wanted, and he started telling people I was trying to abandon Sloane, and then he went further. He told Denise that I must be the father but I tampered, because Vaughn's world has to keep me as the villain. If I'm not the villain, then he is. Sloane finally snapped at him, and when I say snapped, I don't mean a dramatic screaming match, I mean she did something I didn't think she was capable of. She packed a bag, walked out of his house, and went to stay with a friend I had never heard of, and she turned off her location sharing, and she told Denise not to tell Vaughn where she was. Vaughn reacted like a man losing a possession. He showed up at my house the next day. I didn't open the door, I spoke through it, and he told me I was hiding like a child, and he told me he knew Sloane was with me, and he demanded I let him in, and I told him Sloane was not here and he needed to leave, and he kept repeating that he knew she was here, like if he said it enough it would become true. Then he said the line that made my skin go cold. He said if he can't find her, he'll make sure she comes back, and he said it calmly like a promise. My lawyer filed for a protective order on my behalf for harassment, and Sloane's friend helped Sloane file for her own, because Vaughn started calling her employer, calling her friends, calling distant relatives, trying to locate her like she was a missing item. Now the crazy part, the part I didn't see coming, is how Vaughn tried to fix the paternity issue. He contacted me through a new number and said he had proof the baby was mine, and he said he had arranged a better test and he wanted me to meet him, just him and me, to see it. I refused because nothing good happens when Vaughn wants a private meeting, and my lawyer told me to never meet him alone. 2 days later, a woman showed up at my house and I didn't recognize her, and she introduced herself as a paralegal for a law office I had never heard of, and she handed me an envelope, and the envelope contained a drafted paternity acknowledgement with my name typed in and signature lines already highlighted. There was also a letter claiming I had agreed verbally at the party to accept responsibility. That letter was the moment I realized Vaughn was trying to manufacture consent, not just pressure me into it. My lawyer contacted the law office listed, and the law office had no record of this, and the address on the letterhead was real but the phone number went nowhere, meaning someone created a fake legal identity to deliver fake documents. That is when the situation shifted from family drama to something that felt criminal, and I started documenting everything like my life depended on it because it might. Sloane, from her friend's house, finally told me the full reason Vaughn was obsessed with the baby being officially mine, and it wasn't just shame, it was money. Vaughn had taken out loans in Denise's name over the years, Sloane found out recently, and he had also taken out credit in Sloane's name and he was behind, and he believed that if I was legally tied to Sloane through a baby, he could pressure me into paying and he could frame it as supporting the mother of my child, and he could make me look evil if I refused. Sloane told me she found paperwork in Vaughn's office, folders labeled with my name, not just my trust information, but information about my job, my address history, my credit, and she realized he had run some sort of background check on me, likely through a coworker, and he was planning to use my stability to shore up his collapsing finances. When I heard that, I felt this deep nausea because it meant I wasn't a person to him, I was a resource. Sloane also told me that Vaughn was the one who insisted on the engagement party being at his house, and he insisted on the crowd because he wanted witnesses, he wanted the story planted, he wanted the public humiliation to force me into compliance. The next twist was the one that made this feel like a movie, and I'm still not sure I believe it even though I saw the evidence. Sloane's friend, the one she was staying with, works in health administration, and she helped Sloane pull her own medical records properly, and there was a note in the system about a call that rescheduled the paternity test appointment. The call was logged under a number, and the number matched Vaughn's work line. That wasn't just him taking her phone, that was him impersonating her to interfere with medical scheduling, and it created a paper trail. Sloane took that to her lawyer, and her lawyer took it seriously, and suddenly Vaughn's behavior wasn't just controlling, it was documented interference. Then Vaughn made a mistake, the kind of mistake men like him make when they think they are untouchable. He sent Sloane a voice message, and in it he said he didn't care whose baby it really was, he said the baby just needed to be mine on paper, and he said I needed to stop being stubborn and sign, and he said if Sloane wouldn't help, he'd handle it himself. Sloane forwarded it to me, and my lawyer nearly jumped out of his chair when he heard it, because Vaughn had just stated his intent openly. My lawyer sent it to Sloane's lawyer and they coordinated, and that is when I learned something else. Vaughn had been doing similar pressure tactics to other people, not pregnancy-related, but money-related. He'd bullied coworkers into signing for things, he'd used fear and shame, and now he was in a bigger spiral because his tricks weren't working on me. As for the baby, Sloane decided to keep the pregnancy, even though the father is unknown to her in any meaningful way, and that decision is hers. But it also means Vaughn lost his main leverage over me because he can't claim I'm the father when a legitimate test says I'm not. Vaughn is now trying to pivot to making me the villain anyway. He's telling people I abandoned Sloane. He's telling people I manipulated the test. He's telling people I'm cruel, and at this point I don't care what his friends think. I care about protecting myself legally and making sure Sloane is safe from her own stepfather's control. Because even though our relationship is shattered, I can't unsee how terrified she is of him. Final update 7 months later. 7 months later, the baby is here, and Vaughn is not in control of the story anymore. And that is the only reason I can write this without feeling like I need to look over my shoulder every time a car slows down near my house. Sloane gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and she named her something simple and beautiful. And she did it without Vaughn in the room, without Vaughn in the waiting area, without Vaughn's hands on the narrative. Denise left Vaughn 2 months before the baby was born, and that was the most shocking part to me, not because I didn't want her to leave, but because I didn't think she could, and she did. She packed, she moved in with her sister, and she told Vaughn she was done. Sloane moved in with Denise, and their house isn't fancy, it's small and crowded, but every time I've been there it feels lighter. Like the air isn't braced for impact. As for Vaughn, the legal side caught up to him in a way I didn't expect, because it wasn't one big dramatic moment, it was a slow collapse. The fake legal letter backfired, the voicemail backfired, the medical interference log backfired, and Denise found more financial documents while she was leaving, including loans and credit lines she didn't open, and that documentation became the core of a larger case. Vaughn tried to blame Sloan for everything, and when that didn't work, he tried to blame Denise, and when that didn't work, he tried to blame me, and he kept trying to pin the whole mess on anyone but himself. The court granted protective orders and Vaughn violated them twice, not in a dramatic confrontation way, but by contacting third parties and showing up at places he was told not to, and those violations mattered because once a judge sees a pattern, the mask stops working. Vaughn ended up arrested for fraud-related charges tied to the financial documents and for violating the orders, and when I got the call from my lawyer, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted because it took so much damage for consequences to show up. Sloan and I are not together. We tried to talk. We tried to process. We tried to find some version of closure, but there is no easy way to rebuild after someone says I don't love you anymore in front of a room full of people as part of a plan, even if she says she was pressured, even if she cries, even if she apologizes. She told me she did love me. She told me Vaughn convinced her love didn't matter if she didn't have control. And she told me she was ashamed that she let him use her mouth like a weapon. And I believe she believes that, but belief doesn't erase the memory. The baby's father was never identified, and Sloan chose not to chase it. She said she didn't want another man attached through paperwork like a leash, and she said she didn't want to invite a new version of Vaughn into her life, and I understood that in a way I didn't expect. The craziest part, the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, is that Vaughn kept trying to contact me even after the baby was born, not to apologize, not to ask about Sloan, but to ask about my trust. He actually left one voicemail from a blocked number that said we could make this all go away if I helped Denise financially, and that was when I knew he would never change. He would just keep trying different doors until one opened. I don't know what to do with the fact that my engagement ended in front of a crowd as part of a strategy, and I don't know what to do with the fact that the baby line was used like a weapon. But I do know one thing: if anyone ever tries to hand you papers in the middle of an emotional ambush, you sign nothing, you leave, and you let the shock wear off somewhere safe, because shock is the state where predators get signatures.